All right, so now let's do some problems. Before I talk about imaginary numbers, let me just do a recap and just explain how we would simplify the square root of 18, for example. Now we think to ourselves, square root of 18, let's see, what two numbers multiplies to 18? And we know that, 18 is an even number, so it definitely is divisible by 2. So if we took out a 2, we would be left, that's a terrible 2. If we took out a 2, we'd be left with a 9. And so 9 times 2 equals 18. All right? And then we look and we're like, well, we know that 9 is a perfect square. And does everyone know what a perfect square is? It's like, 4 is a perfect square because 2 times 2 equals 4. 3 times 3 equals 9, so 9 is a perfect square. 4 times 4 is 16, so that's a perfect square. So 20, and then it goes on. 25 is a perfect square. 6 times 6 equals 36. 7 times 7 is 49. And so all these numbers are perfect squares. And so we could look at that 9 and could be like, well, 9 is the same thing as saying 3 times 3. And so square root of 2 times 3 times 3. And before we were saying that, when you see two numbers underneath the square root, you could just take it out. And it'll turn into 3 root 2. But just to break that down a little bit more, let me explain to you why that is. All right, because we have square root of 2 times 3 times 3, right? And that also equals square root of 2 times square root of 3 times square root of 3, right? It's all the same thing. And now, remember that if you have something like square root of 2 times square root of 2, you know that equals 2. Because square root of 2 is the same thing as saying 2 to the 1/2. 2 to the 1/2. And when the base is exactly the same, kind of like, if you had something like that, x cubed and x2, the bases, the 2's, like the x's, are exactly the same. So, you could add those exponents and get x to the 5th, right? So in the same way, if it's 2 to the 1/2 to 2 to the 1/2, then you could add those exponents and you'll get 2 to the first power, which equals 2. All right, so in this case, when you have square root of 3 times square root of 3, that equals 3, because 3 to the 1/2 times 3 to the 1/2 just equals 3. So this whole thing gets reduced to just 3, square root of 2, which is the same thing as saying 3 root 2. Just move that 3 to the front, and that's your answer. Oops, just realized that 2 got cut off a little bit, but yeah. So 2 to the 1/2 times 2 to the 1/2 equals 2 to the first, and that equals 2. So now let's talk about the square root of -9. All right, so when we think about this, kind of think about it the same way as we did before. We go square root of, well, it's -1 times 9, right? And that equals the square root of -1 times square root of 9, all right? And that equals, square root of -1 is I, as we know, and the square root of 9 is 3. But we write that as 3i. It just looks a lot better. So the answer is 3i. So now, let's do something a little bit more trickier. And we say, what is the square root of -50? So we do the same thing. Square root of -50 is the same thing as saying square root of -1 times 50. All right? And we know 50 is even, so 2 goes into there. So let's take out a 2 from 50. And so if we do that, we get square root of -1 times 2 times 25, because 25 times 2 equals 50. And then we could also think about it as square root of -1 times square root of 2 times square root of 25. And the square root of 25 is 5, because 5 times 5 equals 25. So we have square root of -1, square root of 2, and we have a 5. Let's move up here. And so we know that square root of -1 is I, and square root of 2 is just square root of 2, and then we got that 5. And to make it look prettier, we'd say 5 square root 2i. So that's the square root of -50. Simplified version. So now, based on what we know, let's try to solve this little math riddle insult cartoon. So we have the square root of negative 16. That's the same thing as saying the square root of negative 1 times 16. The same thing as saying square root of negative 1 times square root of 16. And we know that 16 is a perfect square. 4 times 4 equals 16. So the square root of 16 is just 4, right? And then square root of negative 1 is I. And then we write that as 4i. So what he's shouting at him is 4i. 4 eyes. Because you have glasses. 4 eyes. Wah, wah, wah.